Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
I've got a new catchphrase. Boys and girls, sit down and be quiet. It has to hurt to help, doesn't it? I think this is true of almost everything. And do you know the people I envy the most? In many ways, the people who don't seem to suffer or struggle when they do the right thing. So I am taking tiny, pathetic, frankly, steps towards trying to live a slightly greener life. I was genuinely affected by the Extinction Rebellion protest, and more powerfully, I have to be honest, by Greta Thunberg's interventions. But I heard a story only yesterday evening of a plumber who lives in North London, and he's just had his 25 quid a day, bish bosh, before he's laid a single pipe, until he can get rid of his diesel van and replace it with something that won't be susceptible to the new charge. So have I got the right to tell him to suck it up? That's my question for you today. 0345 6060 973. It has to hurt to help. So do you agree with me that the government... This is the terrible thing about politics at the moment. In fact, in many ways, it's the corollary of what is ludicrously called populism. Populism and popular, oddly, do not mean the same thing in political science. You might be able to find a dictionary definition that lends itself to the notion that populism and popularity mean the same thing. Populism is making promises that can't be kept, which are, of course, popular, because people don't understand when they buy the promise that it can't be kept. So Brexit, in a way, was a populist movement. It still is. The idea that things can be better than the status quo by dint of doing this thing is daft. Blaming Muslims or Mexicans or migrants for problems in the deep south of America or the West Midlands of this country is palpably daft, but it's populist. So popular, of course, is what politicians seek to be. Populist is what fraudsters and liars pursue, and that doesn't stop them achieving power. But what it's done, this rise of populism at the moment, is create, I think, an environment in which politicians have become terrified of doing unpopular things. This is, I mean, long-term thinking. This is probably really important, isn't it? As populism rises, so decent politicians who embrace the difficulties of reality as opposed to the ones that punt and profit from fantasy, decent politicians actually move further away from doing unpopular things. Politicians have to do unpopular things sometimes. The trick historically is to balance out the unpopular with the popular to such a degree that you don't get hurled out of office the first time you do something for the good of the majority, despite the majority not necessarily thinking that it is for their good. So I think that the real movement on for this morning's conversation, clean air, the real movement on clean air is going to have to come. It's going to have to be stick, not carrot. It's going to have to hurt to help.
Well, both Michael Gove and Jeremy Corbyn agree it's a crisis. The scale and speed of climate change has been thrown into focus by Extinction Rebellion and their protests in the centre of London. Tonight, MPs have been voting on whether to declare a climate emergency. A motion tabled by the Labour Party called on the government to take urgent steps to restore the UK's natural environment. In Wales, Assembly members are also being asked to vote there on a similar motion. So let's go live now to our chief correspondent, Alex Thompson, who's in Westminster. Alex.
Well, crowd behind me on Parliament Square seconds ago, a massive cheer. They've got the news that the British Parliament is one of the first major legislators globally to declare a climate emergency. It's not just a rhetorical flourish. It is hoped that once this is done within this place, it'll make it much easier to radicalise moves towards a zero-carbon economy. These people would be of the view that trying to do that at present, which is envisaged by 2050, is not nearly ambitious enough. It sends a big message worldwide, also, of course, to the Chinese, the Indians, and regardless of what the White House might be thinking, the US states as well. Quite a day inside Parliament.
For climate change protesters gathering outside Parliament tonight, the move to declare a climate emergency inside Parliament would mean one of the key demands of the Extinction Rebellion movement would be met and all that in just 2 weeks flat. In the Commons, proposing Labour's motion declaring a climate emergency and setting out a green response to it, the Labour leader said people are protesting and now they're being heard.
Today, Mr. Speaker, this House must declare an environment and climate emergency. We have no time to waste. We are living in a climate crisis that will spiral dangerously out of control unless we take rapid and dramatic action now.
The Prime Minister wasn't there, leaving it to Environment Secretary Michael Gove to establish how the government intends preventing catastrophe.
I also want to make it clear that on this side of the House we recognise that the situation we face is an emergency. It is a crisis. It is a threat that all of us have to unite to meet.
Hours of debate, long on aspiration, short on action. No mention from government or opposition of the major current subsidised expansion of North Sea oil and gas. Nothing too on taxing aviation kerosene like petrol has been for years. They all talk about how we need to fly less. Few seem to have a clue how to achieve it. And, irony of ironies, this debate on the day lawyers removed an obstacle to expanding London's Heathrow Airport, already a major carbon contributor.
Greta Thunberg last week was talking about the emergency and saying that we needed to see action as a result. Will he demonstrate his newfound conversion to this emergency by agreeing that the expansion of Heathrow Airport is quite simply incompatible with our climate change commitments? If it goes ahead, by 2050, aviation, if it's given a blank cheque, could be using up 2/5 of our total carbon budgets.
But Mr Gove declined to answer that question. Without the recent 11 days of Extinction Rebellion protest across London, today's debate would scarcely have happened. Their demand for politics to declare a climate emergency worked. The SNP leader Nicola Sturgeon did it, so too Labour's Jeremy Corbyn. The influence of figures as diverse as Sir David Attenborough's climate change documentary, the intervention of the Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, and the visit to London from Sweden by train from the student climate change strike leader Greta Thunberg. All of which has changed to some extent the political traffic lights to green.
We have to have regard to the warning issued by the Governor of the Bank of England when he said that climate uncertainty was an economic risk, where he said that climate challenges could become challenges in the financial markets.
Things have moved. This was Parliament back in February when it last debated climate change. Not a single party leader turned up, nor did many MPs. And the Commons hadn't debated the issue at all for 2 years prior to this dismal showing. 2 months on, better attendance, commendable cross-party support, and 84 members applied to speak. But, as MPs kept saying today, this chamber is still being led by events, opinions, protest and indeed science, instead of doing its job, leading them.
But first, even leak subterfuge and public sackings don't come close to what is arguably the most serious threat facing humanity. MPs today debated how to solve the climate change crisis ahead of a key report tomorrow that will call for more ambitious targets. The government's Committee on Climate Change is expected to recommend Britain gets to zero emissions by 2050 and that sales of new petrol and diesel cars be banned by 2030. For some, including the Extinction Rebellion protesters, these goals aren't strong enough. For others, they go too far and risk damaging our economy. To discuss how radical we should be, we're joined by Kate Raworth, author of Donut Economics, the Conservative MP Bim Afalami and the former Labour leader Ed Miliband, who's calling for the declaration of a climate emergency. Nice to have you all here. And if I can start with you, Kate, this 2050 ambition to reach net zero emissions, what does that mean to you?
We'll have to see tomorrow when the report comes out, because with these kinds of things, it's all in the detail. Are we talking about domestic emissions in the UK, or are we talking about the emissions that in my clothes and our phones and the lights and everything in the studio that wasn't made in the UK? Are we taking account of flights and shipping? So, and what are the technologies going to be used to deliver this? So we'll have to see when the report comes out. But what really matters is that we had the declaration of an emergency today. I mean, this is the top news story of the day, because this is the only piece of news, to be frank, that our children will remember. And this is the news of the decade. As you said, it's the story of the decade. Today is the day that the UK Parliament recognised that, put it at the top of the political agenda. Now, let's turn that recognition into action. Sometimes it does take disruption to kick off a transformation.
What does
Let's
that
transform.
disruption look like to you?
Oh, to me, the disruption has been created by the people of this country, by school strikes, by Extinction Rebellion. It's put it at the top of the agenda.
Sorry,
let's
what I
create
mean
a
is,
transformation.
What does it actually mean? What do you want to see change? What do you really want to see disrupted that will make a difference?
Okay, so if we recognise climate change as an emergency, we don't build a third runway at Heathrow. We don't frack under our lands. We leave fossil fuels in the last century where they belong. We leap like a leader. We want to be leaders, let's lead. We leap like leaders into renewable energy. We restore our soils. We regenerate and reforest and rewild our lands. We bring back British nature. We show the world that we can create a zero carbon economy here with ambition, with speed. That is what I want to see, and I think we absolutely can do it if we follow through with policies that match this target.
Ed, are you going to leap like a leader?
Definitely.
Well, what does that mean?
I think it's quite a big deal today, actually. Look, it was passed without a dissent in Parliament that we're declaring a climate emergency, cross-party. Now we've got to see action, as Kate says. Look, the most important thing I want to see is the action now to follow to insulate our homes, convert them from gas to renewable heat. I mean, that in itself is absolutely massive. To do that over the next 30 years, it's about 1 million homes a year. We're currently doing about 20,000 homes a year.
And is that government that tells us that we have to do that?
Well, what I would like to see is a sort of army of people going house by house, street by street. This happened in the 1960s and 70s when we converted to natural gas from coal gas. And we need that, and it's going to need government to make it happen. And you know what I think is important about this? This isn't simply about sacrifice. Yes, there is sacrifice, but this is also how you deliver economic justice, because it's going to be employment for hundreds of thousands of people as we make this transition. And I think politics has a responsibility to try and get that across.
Bim, to get to that economic justice, you probably have to put an absolute stop on a lot of the growth that's happening right now in other areas, like Heathrow, like fracking. Are you prepared to say, yeah, that's the side of history we want to be on?
Well, I think it's about the nature of the growth. So I don't think we need to put a stop to economic growth. I don't think that that's advisable. And actually, what economic growth does is it creates the resources to find the technological, innovative solutions that fix the problems. Because ultimately, we're going to get to where we all want to get to. We're going to achieve our aims.
So we keep growing?
Well, no, we have to, but it's about the way in which we grow. So what do I mean by that? If now in the market, there are all sorts of incentives, whether it be around renewables, whether it be around different types of energy generation, whether it be around electric cars, what the government's role should be is creating that incentive structure to make sure that individuals and families in the free market system as much as possible make those choices that are good for the environment. That's how we can grow our economy without sort of at the same time damaging the environment and moving towards a zero carbon future.
Then? It's just about encouragement.
No, I think we are witnessing a transformation of what we think economic progress looks like. And the 20th century was addicted to this ever-rising line of growth. We invented the idea of GDP. It was this one metric of money, and we became obsessed. And every politician was expected to talk about progress as if it was always GDP growth. We know more now. We know too much. We know that our well-being, as in our bodies, our health lies in balance. In our societies and our planet, well-being lies in balance. We need to bring the planet into balance and distribute incomes
Even
far
if that
more
means
equitably across the
no
UK.
Growth.
What it means is incomes into the hands of people who don't have it. Right now, growth is concentrating in the hands of a 1%.
The funny thing about this is that Robert Kennedy, the American politician, said 50 years ago that GDP measures everything but that which really matters. And in a way, it's taken us 50 years to recognise. I sort of rather agree with this. I mean, GDP is not a very good measure of the standards of living of the average person,
but you were
of the public goods.
You led a party. Did you talk about
not
growth
enough.
and GDP?
Oh, yes. No, probably too much.
Too much?
Yeah. Look, and in a way, that's why climate change is the ultimate challenge to politics, because the decisions we make now will have their biggest effects in 20, 30, many generations beyond that. And the reason why I think the economic and social justice part of this is so important is it's a way of showing that tackling this emergency can be central to people's everyday concerns, not just some abstraction. Of course, the threat is important, but also the better life you can build for people is important too.
You had a running leap at this one. Under David Cameron, you had the green oak tree, you had all the talk of, the sort of turning blue, green. That's gone now, hasn't it? I mean, Theresa May was the first one to come out and say school children shouldn't be skipping school for, you know, climate change protests. I wonder if you feel your party is now sitting there awkwardly on the wrong side of revolution.
Right, so there's substantive things and then there's the politics of things. Substantively, this government's done a huge amount of good. I won't list them all, but I'll just come up one statistic that I read earlier. Out of all the G7 countries other than Italy, we've been the fastest to reduce our carbon emissions per head in Britain, compared to all the other G7 countries other than Italy. Now, this government has actually taken lots of good actions. But let me take up the point around economic and social justice, because I think this is a really, really important point. In particular, what you were saying about putting sort of income and wealth into the people who don't have it. In the world at the moment, if we look outside Britain, which we're under 2% of emissions in this country, India and China and countries like where my forefathers came from in Nigeria, you know, people want to improve their standard of living. And we are going to have to be partners with them as they do that and make sure that they do that in a way that is environmentally sustainable. What will not work is if here in Britain, Western politicians say, you can't grow your economies because of climate change. So what we need to do is we need to be partners with them and do that. And I think that the way in which we do that will achieve economic and social justice for many billions of people across the world, not just in this country.
So low-income countries are home to people who, as you say, cannot meet their food, water, housing, health needs. Absolutely, they need their incomes to grow, and they will use totally different technologies, as we know, than the ones that we use, because the world can't afford to go fossil fuels. They're going to leap, and they are leaping, and it's fantastic. Yeah. I'm talking about countries like our own. We're one of the richest countries in the world, and all high-income countries are caught in this extraordinary conundrum. No matter how rich we already are, we always think that the solution to our problems lies always in more growth. We are addicted to endless growth, and that is the existential economic question of our times.
Would you tell people that they can't fly once a year, they can't take their holidays abroad, they can't, you know, use their laptops and their phones?
I don't think it's about saying that. I think there's a really important point here. Look, individuals have to change their behaviour. That is true. And there is an element of sacrifice, but it's got to be fairly shared. But there's a really important point, and it's this. We need system change as much, if not more, than individual change, unless we change the systems by which we operate. Let me give you an example. In Norway, about 60% of new cars sold are electric. In Britain, it's 2%. That's not because Norwegians are necessarily greener by nature than British people, it's because they've got massive incentives to go green. So I think there's a problem here about making people feel powerless. It's all about you sort of doing this for yourself. It's not about you doing it for yourself, it's about government making the big changes and making it possible for people to change.
Thank you all very much. Thanks.
The Times deserves some serious respect this morning as they launch a campaign in response to the discovery that millions of children attend schools in Britain with dangerous levels of air pollution. You know, and Nick spoke to her this morning, that a single London mother has led a campaign following the death of her daughter to see exhaust fumes recognised as a reason for fatality. 6,500 schools educating 2.6 million children in this country are now in areas where fine particles in the air exceed the World Health Organization recommended limit. My challenge this morning is to keep it bouncy, not to get A, bogged down in the science, or B, I think this has to be an example of where we try to steer ourselves away from the binary debate. This is what I mean about politicians have to do unpopular things. 0345 6060973 is the number that you need, because what I want you to tell me is two things. The first thing, historically, why have we allowed things to get so bad? Okay, because this conversation is almost as old as me, and I know there are some lazy answers to that question which may well turn out to be true. Even somebody who is very much on board, but hasn't always been, even I feel when my friend who has an ice cream van tells me that, you know, he can't leave it idling outside the school, and that could affect his livelihood. Another friend who's a plumber tells me that he has to pay this new ULEZ charge, and it means that he's, you know, not actually earning money that's going to go into his bank account and stay there until after his morning tea break. And then you can understand why Emma Thompson invites a lot of criticism when she flies by first class. Did you know that flying first class roughly triples the carbon footprint that you leave if you fly in economy. Can you work out why? It's quite straightforward. It's just space. Takes up so much more room. So, you know, carbon per inch is much greater in first class than it is in economy. And you can understand why. I mean, my natural reaction is always to leap to the defence of people who are trying to do the right thing, even if they're doing it imperfectly. But Emma Thompson's intervention in Extinction Rebellion was problematical because she flew in to do it. She could have done it via... I'm not being funny. She could... God, don't you hate people who say I'm not being funny? Seriously, I've just fallen into yet another trap that I usually deride other people for inhabiting. But she could have done it by billboard. They could have just put up a big... She could have spoken live from Leicester Square or Piccadilly Circus here in central London. She didn't need to be there in person. Do you know, there was a bloke on a different radio station this morning, a campaigner for climate change, and... the presenter, the interviewer, asked him when he last flew, because he was laying down the law on what other people should do. So she said, and I don't think she was trying to trip him up or catch him out, but she said, when did you last fly? And he said, 2004. The presenter said, well, hang on a minute, you must get invited to all sorts of conferences and things. She goes, yes, I travelled to Iceland by container ship once, it took 2 weeks, and I travelled to China by train. And because I was only in China for one conference, it would have been ridiculous, and a lot of other people attending the conference flew in and flew out. I arranged things so that I stayed there for a couple of weeks or more and did... So that doesn't... He didn't sound like someone who was struggling or suffering. He sounded like someone who quite enjoyed doing the right thing. And that's where I get left behind. So... I don't laugh at me, all right? Everyone in the office has already laughed at me for saying this out loud, but I am currently trying to cut out my car in the morning. And it's a huge luxury and privilege to have a car in the morning, both in terms of convenience and in terms of currency. But historically, if you do this slot on a radio station, they give you that you come in by car because it's the best way of guaranteeing that you'll be here when the pips squeak. It's not a job where you can roll in 10 minutes late without any major disruption to your working day. If I'm not here at 10 a.m., then... You know, Nick has to carry on, and no one wants that. You don't want to inflict that upon a waiting nation, or someone has to come in early, or they have to stick on a Steve Allen tape, or something. I don't know what actually happened. So, I've always just very sort of blithely taken advantage of the car into work, and then I just thought I can't really justify this anymore. I just can't because you know can I? We'll see, but it's going all right, you know, apart from yesterday when it was really, really raining. Oh, and the day before when the line was down at my local station and I ended up on the wrong bus going in entirely the wrong direction. But I digress. The point is I'm trying to do something and it's a pain in the proverbial. Do you know what I'd really like to ask you? I'd really like to ask you if there's any advice for those of us who know that we have to do the right thing but find it really hard. How can you help us become one of those people who seems to enjoy doing the right thing? This isn't the kind of programme, and I'm not the kind of person that would ever employ the phrase virtue signalling in a pejorative way. This very odd media-led obsession with trying to undermine and criticise and condemn anybody who's trying to do the right thing. It's really, really ugly. But I do know at some point where it comes from, because I think it explains negativity towards vegetarians. But the problem is on the part of the negative, not on the part of the vegetarian. I used to look at vegetarians and feel that they were somehow judging me. And in many ways they are. But of course what makes it uncomfortable and what prompts the negativity is the knowledge that they're right and you're wrong. I'm nowhere near ready to give up meat yet, for the record, but somewhere deep inside me I know that I should. Or I know I should certainly cut down even more than I have already. So I hope this worked. It's a bit of a flyer as questions go. But if you're somebody who now enjoys doing the right thing, but when you started doing the right thing, you actually hated it, you struggled, what changes that? What makes that sort of journey? What completes that journey? Because the Times make some brilliant suggestions, almost all of which will inconvenience you. Whether or not you do the school run at the moment, and the parents calling for thousands of schools to be protected by the introduction of traffic bans, Okay, that would be a huge pain in the proverbial, right? But you could find a way around it if you had to. The other parents, you could club together if you're far from school and chip in for a bus or a minibus. There are things that you can do. I'm seeing a lot of these electric scooters around the place at the moment, but the minute I mention them, someone else will ring in and say, well, actually, they are 5 times more damaging to the environment than walking. Go, all right, you can walk. The diesel ban, effective diesel ban, or at least the diesel tax, which in London and other places you're seeing charges being imposed or promised on the most polluting cars. That is where I struggle, because hands up on this one, I think that's going to hit people who can afford it least hardest. I have a diesel Volvo that we're about to flog. I don't know what we're going to replace it with yet, but I'm not going to patronise you by pretending that this is going to be a major financial punishment for me and my family. We can absorb this. We can accommodate it quite easily. So I sit here and say, oh yes, well, you should have a ban on diesel cars, and you turn around and say, well, I'm a plumber, or I'm a van delivery driver on, barely on the minimum wage. What am I supposed to do? Sadiq Khan is with us tomorrow, so no doubt he will be asked some of these questions. Today I'd like to ask you, and I love that central one, that fundamental question. I know I'm being very ambitious today, but you haven't let me down yet. How can we, brackets I, close brackets, how can we change from being people who really resent doing the right thing, really find it difficult? I didn't get a seat on the tube today. Can you all form an orderly queue with your tiny violins? How can you change it into actually feeling good about doing the... I think this is the most important question that humankind has ever faced. Sometimes you do a double take, don't you? Did you know that the last week was the first week since the Industrial Revolution in which the United Kingdom has been coal-free in the production of energy? And all the people said we could never do that, and then, of course, I know, it's almost like he haunts everything, isn't it? Donald Trump trying to go back to coal. But the first since the Industrial Revolution, and they reckon that by 2025, energy production in this country, this is why I did a double take, I couldn't quite believe my eyes, will be carbon neutral. Of course, it may already be too late. We seem now, finally. It'll happen with all the other things, a great sweep of history. Do you know, I asked Ian Hislop the other day, he's the guest on my next podcast, the one that's out on Monday. You must download this week's, by the way, the Steve Coogan one. As a massive fan of Steve Coogan over the years, I loved it. So if you are interested in him or a fan of him, I think you will too. I didn't ask him a single question about Alan Partridge. The entire conversation was about Steve Coogan, because the whole point of my Full Disclosure podcast is to try to talk to people about things they don't normally talk about, or to try to find out more about people that we know surprisingly little about. And I asked Ian Hislop why he doesn't get more depressed about the state of politics. And he's a historian, he's a classicist. And of course, if you've read your Juvenal or your Thucydides, your Herodotus, or even your Samuel Pepys, you know, it's all happened before, it'll all happen again. I find that both comforting and bleak, because I thought we lived in a period where some of the ugliest aspects of humanity had been put in a box or put in a corner, had been kept at bay, and now we see them powering back to the front of public conversation. But that's an amazing piece of progress, the idea that we'll be carbon neutral by 2025. But my question today isn't about the bigger picture, it's about the tiny little picture, it's about you. And the question is this: most of us, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, find doing the right thing hard. How can we turn ourselves into people that actually enjoy environmental activity, who enjoy doing the right thing? What is there a trigger? Is there a little thing that... I think you understand what I'm saying. Kirstine is in Leicester. Kirstine, what would you like to say?
Well, hello. I was surprisingly voted in as a Green Party district councillor for the Green Party in my area against Conservatives last Friday.
Oh, congratulations.
And it's not, thank you. But it wasn't because I enjoy doing the right thing.
Oh.
It's because I felt I had to do something. And I'm just a voter like anybody else.
Yes.
And I was just surprised that I got over 10 votes, to be honest. And now I find myself...
have you been elected? This is like that scene in Withnell and I, where you say, I've become a councillor by accident.
Well, it was totally by accident. It was,
what prompted you to do it then? Why did you...
Well, I was a member of the Green Party. You look at the world around you and you become concerned, and it was triggered by many things, one of which was my daughter having, and she's not asthmatic,
right.
But she had an asthma attack on a sports day at school, but she wasn't the only child that was ill. There had been a warning by Leicester University about the air quality. It was a lovely sunny day, idyllic day. I've been to loads and loads of sports days, and we were all taken aback by the children when they were running. Thought, oh, they look a bit strange, they're out of breath.
Really?
Are they that unfit? What's wrong with them? And then they felt like flies, but it wasn't funny, though.
No, sorry.
I mean,
it was funny when you were wondering if they were all unfit. It obviously wasn't funny when they started falling over.
Yeah, well, they were gasping for breath. My daughter happened to be the worst.
Oh, God.
But it was shocking because the teachers obviously had never seen anything like it. They looked surprised and shocked and not really knowing what to do themselves. And I was just very lucky that somebody lent me an inhaler for my daughter. Her lips went blue. She went to the hospital.
Oh, Kirsty.
Yeah. So that's a pretty
I hadn't thought. I'm very grateful to you, and I apologise for laughing. Actually, I didn't realise things were going to get quite so ugly quite so quickly. But
I'm sorry. I'm sorry I did. Actually, it's just when you think about it.
No, I mean, you're absolutely right, and that's helpful, isn't it? Because I'm pondering the question of how you can move from knowing that you should do it but feeling lethargic and resentful to feeling empowered and positive about doing it. Your answer is powerful, but it's personal. I mean, if you see the danger of not acting, that changes the feeling of acting, right? But most of us don't see what you've seen. We hear the story that as you tell it, and we hear other people tell similar stories, but it doesn't... I guess what I'm saying is until you saw it with your own eyes... It's like Thomas in the Bible. You couldn't quite feel it in the way that you do now.
No, and it kind of felt, it's when you watch something like that, it did feel like it's a bit unreal.
If you see your child wheezing in front of you, turning blue, and you know it's because of the air that she's breathing, then taking measures to improve the quality of the air that all children breathe would feel an awful lot easier. I wonder if we need those... Do you remember, I don't know how old you are, but the public service announcements from our childhood, whether we actually need to have footage of children going through what your little girl went through in order to sort of knock on the heads of people who haven't witnessed it firsthand, who haven't seen it personally. That might work.
Well, maybe. I mean, there was an announcement by Leicester University. And
doesn't matter, though, does it? It doesn't resonate in the way that you do when you describe your little girl's lips going blue. That just is going to be worth 1 million press releases from the particle department of the University of Whatsits, isn't it? Every time.
Yeah, well, I just don't want that ever to... Well, it does. It happens to people all the time. But,
and that's the point, isn't it? It needs to, yeah. I mean, humankind is constructed in such a way that until it starts happening almost every day to almost everybody, we probably won't get our fingers out of our fundament. But movement is happening, and I bow to few people in my disdain for what Rupert Murdoch has done for this country. But the Times remains 99% a force for good, and this new law that would make breathing clean air a basic human right is really attractive. Until you ask who pays, you see. And I want to move on to this as well this hour. It's fine for me to sit here as a middle-class cliche on two legs and talk about how I no longer take my chauffeur-driven limousine into work and I'm selling my Volvo diesel, Volvo, and replacing it with a pogo stick because I'm so right on. Yeah? And I understand why that kind of attitude, I'm lampooning it, but some people are very straight-faced about it. That gets up people's noses. More people like Kirstine just telling their own story like that, I think would make it easier for those of us who are a bit cynical, a bit lethargic and a bit resentful to do the right thing with more of a spring in our step. I think that's what we're talking about today. But again, who picks up the bill? Peter is in Acton. Peter, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Hello, mate.
I'm a pensioner. I'm 67. So in 2 years' time, I will not have a vehicle. My vehicle will be taken away. Even though it's a 2012 and it complies with everything, I will have no vehicle, which means
They take your vehicle away? What sort of vehicle have you got?
Well, I've got a diesel, 2012, so it doesn't comply with the things that come in 2021.
They take it away, are you sure?
Well, it's basically taken away, isn't it? Because you have to get rid of it I'm a pension on a basic state pension.
Yeah, but it just means you'd have to pay the congestion charge already, but you'd then also have to pay the ULEZ charge to come into central London. Is it going to start...
Well, I don't want to get into central London. I want to get into Ealing Common, which is basically where I live. So if I want to go out...
And they're expanding the zone, are they? Is that what's happening in 2021? Right, you are.
That's
okay.
Right.
So the north and south circular. Yes, okay.
All pensioners who are on a basic pension who cannot afford new cars, basically legs are taken away from them.
And when you hear the last lady describing her child's lips going blue because of the air that she's breathing, and we're both responsible for that. We're in a similar part of West London. A primary school as you come in on the A4, the old Victorian one on the left, has some of the highest levels of pollution in the country. And you and I both drive our diesel cars down that road. Something's got to give, hasn't it?
Yeah, but James,
go on.
The borough councils allowed not far from you, Brentford Leisure Centre, industrial estate. Next to there is a new school, which is under the M4 and next to the South Circular.
Yes, but that's another argument for improving the air. It's not an argument for letting you keep your diesel car, Pete.
Yeah, but that's been allowed to be built.
It's because we need to... You can't stop building schools.
Yeah. No, I'm not saying don't stop building schools, but think about the pensioners. Think about the old people who...
I am, and I'm asking what can we do? Because we can't keep driving these vehicles. We just can't.
Well, all the showmen, you've allowed them licences to come in and out of London free of charge.
With respect, mate, what you're doing is, and I understand why you're doing it, you're not answering any of the questions that I'm asking. You're saying, yeah, but what about them, and what about them, and what about them? And that's why children are dying now, because we've always responded, what about China? What about India? What about this? What about that? What about the noxious fumes that come out of the car I drive? No, Peter, I haven't finished.
Yeah.
The noxious fumes that come out of the car I drive and the car you drive can be removed from the environment. Tell me why that shouldn't be done.
That can be done.
Yeah, so that means you can't drive your car anymore. So we need some sort of financial help or...
Yeah, financial help to get the particular filter that will go on my vehicle and make it clean.
Well, let's talk to Sadiq Khan about that tomorrow, if you want to ring back in again. And Peter makes some valid points. It's fine for me to get impatient with whataboutery, but it's a huge part of the climate change problem. Why should we do this, that and the other? Because people in Beijing are doing that. It just doesn't work. Eventually, change has to start from a seed. It has to start with people doing, I don't care what everyone else is doing, I'm going to do the right thing. Problem is, I don't get that warm glow of self-righteousness inside when I do the right thing. I just get the hump. Stand there, but do you know what I get cross about at the moment? Used to be John Humphrey's ludicrous bias on the Radio 4. which I'd listen to in the car. Now it's schoolboys with enormous backpacks. And I know they've got loads and loads of books and there's not a lot they can do about it. But if you just turn around, if you take 3 people out when you turn around with a massive rucksack on your back on the train or the tube in the morning, then surely tomorrow you'd take your... No, I've done it. I'm turning into Victor Meldrew. Quick, let's head towards the headlines. I think it's really important. My challenge, of course, is to do it in a way that doesn't bore you to tears. But we need to talk about the air. We need to applaud the Times for launching a massive campaign today to improve the quality of the air that we breathe. Here are some of the things on the manifesto. A new Clean Air Act. Do you know which country introduced the first Clean Air Act? Yeah, it was us. Back in the day when we led the world, instead of sat around moaning about the fact that the world turns. Ban sales of new diesel and petrol cars from 2030 and reverse cut to green car grants. So what happened to Hugger Husky? Why did they reverse the green car grants? The Clean Air Act would confer a legal right to unpolluted air for everyone in the UK. Temporary traffic bans outside schools at drop-off and pick-up times. That works, I have to tell you. Those little scooters are pretty special. I'm just hearing Danny Baker has been fired from BBC Radio 5 as a result of that tweet, which I was poised to defend after 11 o'clock today, despite an almost unanimous attack. On the grounds that, and this needs to be triple-checked, on the grounds that he routinely... has a chimpanzees dressed as famous people without any racial subtext whatsoever. So obviously the subtext changes hugely when the gag is applied to a child of colour, a child of ethnicity, ethnic minority, or black, you know, it changes, of course it does, but I don't think that was even close to Danny Baker's brain when he sent that tweet, because he does loads of stuff about human beings, about monkeys and apes dressed as human beings. The massive racist history of conflation of gorillas and apes with people of colour is disgusting, and I'm afraid it's a matter of fact, it's a matter of historical record. But I don't think that Danny Baker did that. But I'm very, very conscious of being a huge fan of the guy and not wanting to believe that there could be a racist bone in his body. So I think, even though we now know he has been given his marching orders by Radio 5, BBC, a very, very querulous organisation in many ways, a little bit frightened of its own shadow in the aftermath of the Jimmy Savile scandal and the Lord McAlpine scandal. Oddly enough, not that frightened of its own shadow, and it's bringing in blowhards like Nigel Lawson to talk about climate change on their flagship news programmes, despite the fact that Nigel Lawson is about as qualified to talk about climate change as Timmy Mallet is to talk about astrophysics. But there we are, no offence to Timmy. So we probably will talk about that. But before that, we're talking about this. And this is a very personal question that I hope resonates with others. I hope it's not confined just to me. When you do the right thing environmentally, my little girl does it, and she enjoys doing it. There was a story about 5 years ago about a family that had managed to recycle everything, and the only thing that was left in their rubbish bin after 12 months was human hair. The only thing they couldn't actually find recycling facilities for was human hair, and they got a massive kick out of it. And I remember, first of all, feeling wow, admiration, and then feeling, oh, get over yourself, because you made me feel bad about how little I do. That's the mountain I want to get over today. And some of the answers to the question will, of course, include frightening, really frightening stuff, as happened to Kirstein's daughter on Sports Day. Habiba is in Redbridge. Habiba, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi there, James. Thanks for having me on.
You're very welcome.
I just wanted to raise the issue about developments being built alongside roads, and why, obviously, we're talking about...
You can't build them anywhere else. Unless I'm missing something here. Where else can you build a development if it's not next to a road?
Well, not right next to a road where you've got a school.
Well, how are the building materials going to get there then?
If you just listen to what I've got to say, maybe you'll see my point.
Go on.
Well, the thing is, the local Tesco's that we go to has just put in a application to build against the road, which is okay. We do need the infrastructure, but at the same time, they're building a school right next to the busy road. But you're talking about schools, obviously, not having, we're trying to cut back on the pollution. And all that's happening at the moment is developments like this that go up with no regard to...
So where would you put them instead, then?
Well, not right next... You wouldn't put a school right next to the road when you're talking about air pollution and cutting it.
But where else would you put it, then?
Leading by
in a field?
Well, there must be other sites, right?
But they're going to be next to roads. I'm really sorry, but this is a surreal conversation. You're going to build a school with no road access.
No, we're not saying no road access, because it's going to be built next to a road at some level. We've got a school which is down the road to us.
So don't build schools next to very busy roads. That's not the answer to the problem. In the short term, I think I can see where you're coming from, but the answer is not to have polluting cars on busy roads, to have electric cars, to have non-petrol and diesel cars. But
again, what you're saying is that is the bigger issue as well, which you're not going to tackle in a day. But we're saying if there is a need...
So where would you build the school, then?
To be built. Well, you wouldn't build it right next to the road.
Don't tell me where you wouldn't build it. Tell me where you would build it.
Well, you'd build it on the other side, possibly, but the whole development...
On the other side of the same road?
No, not on the same road. I mean, you don't know what development I'm talking about.
When they build schools, they do it because they've looked at where schools are needed. They've looked at catchment areas. They've looked at geography. Why are you talking over me? This is the most surreal conversation I've ever had. I'm going to ask you again. How can you build a school that is not on a road?
Well, I'm not saying it shouldn't be on a road. It shouldn't be on the road that they're trying to build on. Like, we know that...
So where would you put it, then?
Obviously. Well, firstly, our borough does not need a primary school there. So firstly, you just need to scrap that.
Well, then it'll be empty and there's nothing to worry about. If it doesn't need a primary school, there won't be any children in it, so they won't be breathing in the air that's coming from the cars on the road that you need to get to the school in the first place. 10:40 is the time. Honestly. Fergal's in Putney. Fergal, I've got a feeling I might be at the wrong end of the stick, but at the moment... That was absolute madness. What are we going to do? Build schools where there's no roads? That'll solve all our problems. So the kids can fly to school. What did you ring in to say?
Very lively conversation this morning.
Unexpectedly so, Fergal. I'm not going to lie to you.
Yeah, so I work in renewable energy, and I get asked quite a lot by people what they can personally do.
Yes.
And we're going through like an age of enlightenment of actually realising how we're actually living our lifestyle is actually destroying the planet and the environment, and ultimately humanity and the species and everything that lives on it. And so we've got this big kind of wake-up call, and now we're kind of realising what we have to do is so absurd and so many changes. It just seems like it's like it's never going to happen.
Yeah.
So what we have to look at it is we have to start looking at like in small little steps. So I think the first thing people need to do is become aware and understand everything has a cost, everything has a carbon cost.
I mean, to give people illustrations of what I think you're describing, it's that mindset, and I understand this mindset, but I'm trying to resist falling into it, where you think, why should I buy a reusable cup? They're building a block of flats round the corner. Do you see what I mean? Or why should I buy a reusable cup? Look at the state of smog in Delhi. And that I get that mindset. It's nuts, but it's seductive, isn't it? It's comforting to think that I've got a massive excuse here for not having to do what I know I should be doing.
Well, what we know now is if we don't make all these changes, we're going to have like a very unlivable planet within our lifetime. And if anybody has children within, they're not going to have the world that we have and that enjoyed what we've enjoyed. So it's very unfair. It's very unfair to the poorest people in the world, because it'll be
But you are, if I say righteous rather than self-righteous, I hope that doesn't. Did you just wince?
just back to the question of like what people can do. So it's almost like you've discovered that you've got type 2 diabetes and you have to make changes to your lifestyle.
Like Tom Watson, and look at the changes he made to his lifestyle. But you need someone to come up behind you and burst a paper bag, don't you, to frighten you into action, like Kirstine, our first caller, whose little girl turned blue on sports day, and she's now a Green councillor. But I don't want it to come to that for everybody. I want to find a way of getting them to act before something awful happens, before they get diabetes, metaphorically speaking.
Well, so I think part of it is enlightenment and actually listening to the science, listening to the reports from the governments and news that's coming out about where we're actually heading for, and start looking at kind of what changes that we can make, and start doing small incremental changes that are stepped up each time. So
yes, but I know what you're saying is true, but I don't know if you understand the mindset I'm describing, because you're not cursed with it. And the mindset I'm describing is, I nearly used an inappropriate word. I can't be bothered to get the tube this morning. I'm going to reactivate my car booking, or come on, it's raining. Let's get a cab home, or in the cases of other people, perhaps an Uber.
You see, this is the problem. We are all sinners. We're all part of the problem.
Yeah, but some people seem to enjoy not being sinners. I want to be like them, but we do.
Yeah, well, if you can have the carrot and stick approach, you can have people voluntarily doing things, but then, the other end of it, you're going to have to start introducing like a carbon allowance.
And I'd be comfortable with. That's what I mean sometimes when I say on the programme, I wish the grown-ups would hurry up and get here. I now know there aren't any grown-ups, or even more terrifying, we're the grown-ups. But the grown-ups should actually be passing laws saying, no, sorry, you can't do that anymore. We talked about the smoking ban yesterday. I'll tell you why after this.
A landmark report from the United Nations is warning humans are rapidly destroying the natural world. It is the largest study of its kind, and the United Nations panel of experts has found that up to 1 million animal and plant species are facing extinction over the coming decades, with 40% of amphibians under threat and a third of marine mammals. Well, the UN panel calls for urgent action to save the biodiversity of the planet on which humanity's survival depends. Our science correspondent Rebecca Morell reports.
From the oceans to the land, from insects to exotic plants, life on Earth is declining at its fastest rate in millions of years. This is the stark conclusion of a major new UN report, which warns the planet is facing an ecological crisis.
If life on Earth is in trouble, we are on trouble. Our future is at stake. There's really no human future without a future for the fabric of life that sustains us.
The report details the destructive impact that humans are having on the environment. 75% of all the land on Earth has been severely altered by humans. 85% of wetlands have disappeared since the 18th century. They're now vanishing at a faster rate than forests. And plastic pollution has increased tenfold since the 1980s. The backdrop to this is that human population has doubled in the last 50 years, adding growing pressure to the natural world. And take a look at the bigger picture. Everything in nature plays a role, even the smallest creatures, like the narrow-headed ant in Devon. The insects keep the soil healthy, they break down organic matter, and they're also food themselves for birds and small mammals. But they're now on the brink of extinction. These tiny ants are the last of their kind. They used to be widespread, but this small patch of heathland is the only site left in England. All around them, their habitat has been destroyed, and it would just take for this last refuge to go, and this species would be lost forever. The UN says there are solutions, but we'll need a major rethink of how we use land, especially for agriculture. Deforestation will also have to end, so the forests can grow again. And the pollution making our oceans uninhabitable cleaned up. But the report says our insatiable use of the planet's resources needs to stop now.
We shouldn't waste our food. We should conserve our energy. We should conserve our water. So all of us, from the individual to the government and the private sector, we all have a role to play. And it's doable. We're not asking people to drastically change their lifestyle, but be more careful.
The window of opportunity for nature's global rescue plan is small. The UN says if we fail to act, many species will be left fighting for survival. Rebecca Morel, BBC News, Paris.
Now, wildlife and habitats across the world are declining at an unprecedented rate, putting up to 1 million species of plants and animals at risk of extinction. That's according to a major new report by scientists backed by the United Nations. It warns that our behaviour is posing a direct threat to economies, food security, health and human well-being. And they're calling for transformational change to stop the damage getting even worse. Anya Pop reports.
Restoring wildlife in the city. At the London Wetland Centre, helping reconnect people with the natural world is at the heart of what they do.
That's one way that you can identify them.
Something more pressing than ever. Today, a damning report by UN scientists says nature is in more trouble now than at any other time in human history, with extinction looming over 1 million species of plants and animals. The damage is all down to humans, but the scientist behind the report says it's not too late to fix.
It's a moral issue. We should not destroy nature. And it's an ethical issue because the loss of biodiversity hurts the poorest of people, further exacerbating an already inequitable world. Unless we act now to reduce the loss of biodiversity, we will undermine human well-being for current and future generations.
South America, Amazon's been depleted. Africa, lots of logging.
Today's report didn't come as a shock to those working in conservation. What is biodiversity?
Biodiversity is everything that's on this planet. It's us, but it's every piece of wildlife, every insect, every bit of habitat, every plant, every tree. It's where it all fits together and it sort of makes a big circle and it all supports each other. And we're part of the problem now because we're not supporting it. In fact, we're destroying it, and that's not helping the planet. Ultimately, it won't help us, and it won't help the wildlife that's on the planet.
The report highlights we're not just damaging land habitat, but ocean life too. Marine plastic pollution has increased tenfold since 1980. It's causing great harm to over 80% of turtles, almost half of seabirds, and almost half of marine mammals such as whales and seals.
We're really seeing people around the world waking up to the threat of plastic pollution and those other pressures that are facing marine life, but we're not seeing enough action right now. Governments are talking about the threats, and that is one positive step, but that really needs to be followed with bold action.
The environment has risen to the top of the political agenda. Just last week, Parliament declared a climate emergency. Today's evidence that we're heading towards an ecological disaster will only intensify the calls to reassess our relationship to the natural world, and fast.
Well, joining me now is Izzy Warren, a 15-year-old environmental activist, and Dilys Rowe, who's a biodiversity researcher at the International Institute for Environmental Development. Dilys Rowe, let's start with you first. There have been repeated warnings of this kind of nature. How urgent would you say is the need for action now?
It's really urgent, and it's shocking that we've not taken action before now, despite all the repeated warnings. And it's particularly urgent for the poorest people in the poorest countries who will be most profoundly hit by the devastation of nature.
So, Izzy Warren, you feel fully justified in skipping school to mount your protests that you've been doing?
Yeah, I think this is the greatest threat that humanity has ever faced. It's universal. It doesn't respect all of these human constructs like borders and money. It will happen regardless of whether we talk about it or not. All we can do now is put all of our efforts and resources into stopping it.
Well, you talk about effort and resources. We're talking about transformational change. That's what the UN is demanding. What exactly does that mean, Dilys Rowe?
That means far more radical change than we've seen to date. It means a thorough change in the way we do business, thinking about GDP in different ways. Specifically, it means changes by governments, financial institutions and the private sector in removing the subsidies and tax breaks that are there for harmful industries such as industrial agriculture, industrial fishing, fossil fuel production, and replacing those with environmentally friendly incentives.
When you talk, as the UN has done, about, less of a focus on GDP growth, that means really, call a spade, that we're all going to be poorer, doesn't it?
It doesn't mean we're poorer, it means redefining how we view our quality of life and not just basing it totally on material consumption, but also thinking about other values that we get from nature and factoring those into our quality of life.
Well, Izzy Warren, what do you say to that? That, if we want to save the planet, really, we've got to be prepared to dig into our pockets. Would you be happy in the future when you grow up to be poorer because of this?
I don't think being sustainable is directly linked to being poorer. I think what we need to be doing is transitioning away from this belief that being successful is this kind of idea of infinite economic growth. We need to be transitioning from this linear economy that is founded on the basis that we can just keep exploiting and exploiting these infinite resources on what is ultimately a finite planet, and instead transitioning to a more circular economy.
So are you prepared yourself to sort of put your money where your mouth is and, go on fewer holidays that involve big, long flights, use your car less, eat less meat, because all these things we're supposed to sacrifice, aren't we? What do you think?
I think those are perfectly reasonable sacrifices to make, because what's the alternative? If we don't make these sacrifices, and those are fairly small things to make, people are already dying because of climate change. There are meant to be 200 million climate refugees by 2030. We can't ignore these facts. We can't ignore the fact that this will have an incredible impact on human life. So those are sacrifices that I believe, and I think most of my generation actually believe, are willing to make.
And what kind of sacrifices do you make on a daily basis, would you say?
I'm vegan. I very rarely drive a car. I take public transport. I'm trying to go plastic-free and zero waste. And also I speak about this stuff. I strike from school, and that is a big sacrifice to make. It's not something that any student does lightly. We're not trying to skip school. But it is what we feel the only way to get our voices heard, because, quite frankly, petitions and protesting on weekends, that hasn't done anything. We've been doing that in the past, and governments haven't listened. No one's acknowledged us. The only time we've gotten kind of news headlines, the only time we've gotten actual recognition from politicians is when we put stuff on the line for them, and that is striking.
Well, Dilys Rowe, that's the point, isn't it? I mean, Izzy Warren here is an incredibly powerful advocate, but are the politicians listening?
They haven't been listening to date. As I said, we've heard endless warnings about the dire state of nature. The fact that they have begun to take more notice about climate change and declaring the climate emergency is a positive step forward. But they really do need to listen more. They need to listen to the younger generation. They also need to listen to indigenous peoples and local communities in poor countries that are managing their lands and their wildlife sustainably. But they need to go beyond listening. We need to actually take action now.
Well, Izzy Warren, what action are you going to be taking next to try and make the adults and the politicians sit up and...
We are continuing our strike on May 24th. Young people across the UK, across Europe, will be taking to the streets again to continue to demand climate justice. We want actual action on climate change. Declaring a climate emergency is great, but it's just words. It's entirely symbolic words. And while it does show that the government recognises the threat that we're facing, it doesn't say that they're actually going to do anything about it. We've heard so many words from them, and there's very little evidence to prove that they are actually listening.
You're not going to let them off the hook on this one?
Absolutely not.
Izzy Warren, Dilys Rowe, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me this evening, Harriet Sargent and Stig Abel. Welcome back to both of you. Let's get to a really important story in the Eye.
Another important story.
Leading on it, yes. Well, there's an irony to it, isn't there? We're talking about a new baby in the world, and yet, you know, the suggestion in these reports about the extinction threat is overpopulation.
Too many babies.
So there's the Eye, Planet in Crisis, 1 million species at risk of extinction.
And the question for all of us, I think, is how many headlines like this, all of us, collectively, the human population with agency to do anything about it, how many times are we confronted by the fact that the gradual industrialisation of the world, the gradual agricultural revolution that's taken place over the last couple of thousand years is leading us to a place where we are compromising the environment such that it will affect our ability to live in the medium term, let alone the long term. That seems to be more or less an established fact. We know that. Things that we have done collectively are ruining the environment that's going to have a catastrophic consequence for us. Are we willing, collectively, in terms of governmental action, or individually in terms of a sense of personal responsibility, to take steps where we say, I could have another child, I could fly twice a year, I could eat meat, but I'm not going to. I'm not going to use single-use plastics. I'm going to take steps to try and stop this, even if people might say, well, it's completely futile because India and China and countries and other parts of the world are still churning out lots of pollution. Are we collectively going to do it?
It is really hard, isn't it? Because human beings have shown themselves to be eminently adaptable, but normally when they're gaining something like a motor vehicle, we don't normally have to take things away from what we've become used to.
And also the problem is that where this is, we're facing two problems, one good and one bad. And the bad one is that population is increasing, and the population in Africa is about to double. But the other thing is that even in countries where the population isn't increasing, as in China, you've got a rising middle class, which is a good thing in that everybody's getting more prosperous. But unfortunately, if everyone, and this is the sort of terrible fact we try to tiptoe around, but if everyone has the same standard of living as an American, this planet's just going to come to an end. We cannot have all of us living like sort of American middle-class person. So what are we going to do?
And has there ever been in the history of human development where mankind has collectively said we can have the ability to do X, Y, and Z, but we are going to choose not to for a greater good? That feels like, if that's what we're relying on, that part of human nature where we see these problems, and that's why I was kind of the climate change protests. At least I feel that they've shifted the conversation. The conversation that would have been had 5 years ago, you'd be debating science endlessly and pointlessly. I think we're kind of past that now.
Yes, that's true.
There's a common sense position. Things are screwed.
Things are bad. I mean, it was before we were all saying, no, it's not true, it's not true.
Well, tell that to the US president, though.
Well, indeed, and you have I interviewed David Attenborough, and I said that to him. And I said, are you depressed? And he kind of said, well, no, if we change things, things will happen. And maybe, I said, would you talk to Trump? And he said, if Trump spoke to me. But Trump has there's a cold snap in New York, and he thinks that's proof that climate change doesn't exist. And he's the one saying that. They're not in the Paris Accord. But the danger of that is, if you believe that the US isn't going to do anything, China's not going to do anything, therefore there's no need for us individually to do anything, that's the other paralysis that happens. Because if you believe that the problem is so big, your individual actions will not help.
But I think we need to be a lot more honest about what is going to change everything. And this very interesting report also came out last week, which actually told you what every action does, how many tonnes of emissions it produces. And, the fact that you avoid air travel, well, you're only saving 1.6 tonnes a year. If you don't have that third child, you're saving 58 tonnes a year. So I think that's enlightening. I mean, I don't think many people know that.
Well,
and I think we immediately would start doing the right thing.
Each small action done millions of times over is multiple actions, isn't it?
And maybe we should also be taxed on emissions rather than taxed on other things. If emissions is the most threatening thing in the world, you are allowed X amount of emissions per year, and every time you go over it, that's when you're taxed.
Just very quickly, we've run out of time to our...
already come up with ideas.
Axe vehicles from school streets, make it a legal right to unpolluted air for everyone in the UK. Extend the pre-2016 and pre-2006 diesel and petrol pay zones to other cities, pollution monitors in every postcode. The UK used to lead the world in these matters. It's still by far from the worst offender, but as the Clean Air United Nations Special Representative on Human Rights and the Environment said last night, we once led the world, but are now, to quote the Special Representative, a laggard and a scofflaw. God knows where the United Nations representative for matters environmental is getting his nouns from, but or hers. David Boyd, was a British fellow who's used the word laggard and scofflaw in polite conversation any time recently. There's a man after my, apart from you, Keith, obviously. There's a man after my own heart here. You scofflaws. What's a scofflaw? Don't use words you don't know the meaning of. Scofflaws. You scofflaws. You filthy scofflaws. I know what a laggard is. That's someone who lags behind, you see. Someone, slow coach. Scofflaw. Unless I've misread it or there's a typo in the Times newspaper. And speaking of typos, did you see that story about the Australian banknote? Millions of banknotes, $50 notes. 46 million, in fact, to be precise, with a spelling mistake. I like doing worst thing you ever did at work, biggest mistake you ever made at work, but I don't want to do it as a phone-in, all right? If you send me, and I've got my email account open now, first time in a while, so james@lbc.co.uk, somebody here, and it will work as a text, it might struggle to get it into a tweet, but give it a whirl, by all means, 84850 on the text, or at Mr. James OB on the tweet. Somebody signed that off. Somebody signed off a banknote. Somebody somewhere in Australia is currently staring into a toilet bowl, presumably, or just into oblivion, knowing that when push comes to shove, when the inquiry is complete, it was their fault that the spelling mistake appeared in a micro text. It's a quote from a book, Tales of the Australian Aborigines, and the first speech to the Australian Parliament by Edith Cowan, who was Australia's first female member of Parliament. And this micro text is wrong. It's got a mistake in it. So what's the biggest boo-boo you did at work? 10:51 is the time. Alexandra is in Northampton to steer us back towards the environment and the challenge that many of us have with doing the right thing. What do you want to say, Alexandra?
Hi, James. Thank you for having me on. Now, just wanted to point you in one direction. Yes, we have an issue with pollution, not just by school, not just by motorways, not just London, not just Manchester.
No,
it's even on the main roads.
Yes.
I don't live directly in Northampton. I live by one of the main roads that leads between Northampton and Milton Keynes.
Okay.
And I swear to you, when M1, junction 15, is shut or there's an accident or something, at the moment there are roadworks that are going to be continuing until 2023, apparently.
Yes. Good grief.
The road between Northampton and Milton Keynes is completely gridlocked. You can see the pollution in the air.
You can taste it sometimes, can't you?
You can taste it. It's in the back of your throat. My kids cough excessively, and none of my kids are asthmatics, but we have to cross that road to get to school.
Yes, of course.
Obviously, we, as a family, we are strictly hybrid family, and that stems from the fact that my partner works for one of the pioneers manufacturers of the cars that deals with the hybrid technology.
So you get a staff discount?
No, it doesn't go. He has the company car. I'm
only teasing. I'm doing that thing, though, you see, because I don't. I've got a diesel car. I'm an idiot. But I did believe the government when they told me that was a good thing to buy, and now I'm going to have to sell it. So I'm a little bit jealous of you, that's all. Yes.
That's the thing. You bought into the idea when a few years back, I don't remember, don't ask me about when that was. A few years back, the government was putting the lower tax, the CO2 emissions were getting better, the MPGs were great on diesels, the diesels car were being sold left, right and centre for being such a wonderful, the turbo diesels when they came out, and the catalysts on them were fantastic, and so on and so forth. Now, at some point, VWs packs up on the whole actual emissions that they have. That was a big scandal. And if you maybe perhaps remember, in 2017, the government hinted that the diesel cars now, up until, I think, until 2020, will start getting higher tax rates because of the pollution they create.
Yeah, that's right.
Regardless how great the engines may have been presented a few years back, now the government want to introduce, I don't know if that's going to go ahead, want to introduce...
Well, they're going to have to do stuff that's unpopular, and then the problem with British politics at the moment is you'll get some idiot standing up saying, well, why can't I breathe in diesel fumes? It's outrageous, it's the nanny state. So the politicians who want to do the right thing are being sort of undermined at every turn by politicians who lie for a living and who do the populism. So you probably could find someone who wanted to reverse the smoking ban if you looked hard enough.
But if you think about politicians, you're saying, yes, they want to do the right thing. However, when the hybrid came out, when the electric cars came out, they were exempt from tax. Now, if you buy a car that's over a certain amount of money, which is £40,000, if you buy a car that's hybrid, that costs more than £40,000, you have to pay almost £500 a year for 5 years.
If you've got over 40 grand to drop on a car, I'm afraid you should be paying. I mean, tax is there to pay for the other stuff, not so you can use it as an incentive in the short term to get people to change their habits. But the government still needs to raise tax from motorists in order to provide all of the infrastructure and other issues that motorists demand and deserve. So you can never have an indefinite tax break for buying a car that's healthier than another car, because then the infrastructure would collapse. There'd be no money raised to... Oh, it's a little bit more complicated than some people allow.
It is a lot more complicated than this, but you have to remember, like, for example, like I said to you, in 2017, the government had synced it, and my partner's company, it's the same day, there went a memo out to all the, throughout the board, that all the diesel cars from their company, from their manufacturer, apart from the van.
No, I know, and that's politicians. Why do politicians do that? A, to raise money. B, I'm really sorry, because I appreciate this is becoming close to a stark record. Look at the money and effort and expenditure that is put in by secretly funded think tanks and quotes educational charities end quotes that are dedicated to resisting the so-called nanny state, promoting so-called classical liberalism, which means very, very simply protecting the interests of incredibly rich people who make money out of making the rest of us less healthy, obese and ill. That is your fossil fuel lobby, in a nutshell. Used to be your smoking lobby, still is in many ways, although they've finally been put on the back foot. And if you can put the nicotine lobby on the back foot, you can put the fossil fuel lobby on the back foot. But you have to want to do it. And if the fossil fuel lobby is bankrolling politicians, pundits, think tanks, and all of the above, then the rest of us have to resist. We have to be the ones that put them on the back foot, because politicians are not going to risk unpopularity in the current climate. Keith's in Peterborough. Keith, what would you like to say?
Yes, good morning, James.
Hello, Keith.
I was a bus driver for about 20-odd years or so, and back in the 1970s and 1980s, and we had about 30 or 40 buses undercover here in Peterborough.
Undercover buses?
Now,
what were they pretending to be? Sorry,
anyway,
Keith. No, you're quite right to move on. Thank you for rescuing me from
in
that.
the winter,
yes.
When it was cold, the fitters used to go around with a load of batteries on a little trolley to start all the buses up to make sure they were warmed up and that there was no problems with starting.
Yes.
So, by about 6:30 in the morning, there were about 30 or 40 buses all sitting there with their engines running, and you can imagine the amount of smoke that was collecting in the garage. In fact, when you used to walk in to try and get a bus, you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Now, I was a union rep in them days, and I remember going up to management and saying to them, surely this has got to be detrimental to our health. And their argument was, if it was dangerous, they'd have done something about it by now, and that was it. That is the sort of attitude that was prevailing then.
Yeah, but then it was fair enough. Actually, I think, no, then it was defensible. You were ahead of your time, Keith. You were a goddamn pioneer, man. Seriously. You were an environmental canary down the proverbial coal mine. But back then, I don't think it was unreasonable. My dad was covering the car industry in Birmingham at the time, and if you'd said to him that this is going to kill future generations of children, he wouldn't have known what you were talking about, Keith.
I mean, every winter, well, not every winter, but most winters, if I catch a cold, which you do, it almost invariably turns into bronchitis. Now, I can't prove that it's got anything to do
But you think it's weakened your chest? It's weakened your chest in some way. It probably has, and we'll never know. And we'll never know. It's not going to be like asbestos, is it, where you can prove a link or you can demonstrate the dangers. But Keith, mate, it's not just the vehicles. When we were kids, you'd see the massive chimneys. I always remember if you drove up to Doncaster, at one point you'd have a massive power station on one side of the motorway and another massive power station on the other side of the motorway, belching smoke into the atmosphere, and people honestly didn't think that it was going to do any harm. Younger listeners, I like saying that, younger listeners, may find this very, very hard to believe. But just by way of illustration, if you're finding it hard to believe that we used to look at power stations and think, wow, it's magnificent. Look at that, humanity harnessing raw materials to stride forward into a new era of interactivity and technology. You're not going to believe this, but they used to advertise the health benefits of cigarettes. You can find them online, advertisements of doctors saying, I don't know, a Regal a day keeps the doctor away or something. I don't know if they ever use that exact slogan. So if you're struggling to believe that we used to look at power stations and not see a problem, we used to look at cigarettes and see a health benefit.